Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Hefner, and today we're going to do the last of our introductory lessons to the Killer Angels. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the things that led to the Civil War and a quick overview of what had happened in the first couple of years of the war before we get to the setting for the Killer Angels, which is specifically the Battle of Gettysburg. We're going to go kind of quickly today. Don't stress out about notes. I'm going to be giving you a lot of just enrichment information, but occasionally I'll mention the novel because some of these things that happened early on get referred to by characters in the Killer Angels, and it might make for a better understanding of the novel if you understand sort of what those characters would have understood. So we'll go quickly. Let's get started. We're going to be reading fiction with the Killer Angels, but if you get bitten by the Civil War bug, and a lot of people all around the world, not just the United States, have, there are Civil War buffs everywhere, you might try out some recommended nonfiction first. One of the series that I've read that I would recommend is The Civil War by Shelby Foote. It's a 3-volume collection studying the Civil War, and it has sort of a Southern perspective to it. If you'd rather take a Northern perspective to the Civil War, then I recommend The Civil War by Bruce Catton, and this is also a 3-volume set of nonfiction. If you'd like something a little bit shorter and just in one volume and very scholarly, try Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. James McPherson was a professor at Princeton University, and this book won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Now, if you like the fiction, and you can still learn a lot from fiction, I might recommend a couple things. One of them is Jeff Shaara. Now, we're reading The Killer Angels by Michael Shaara. Jeff Shaara is Michael Shaara's son, and he sort of turned the Killer Angels into a trilogy. He wrote a prequel called Gods and Generals, which takes you from the start of the war right through the Battle of Chancellorsville, so it stops shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg. And then you have Michael Shaara's book, The Killer Angels, which is specifically focused on the Battle of Gettysburg. And then Jeff Shaara wrote a sequel, which he called The Last Full Measure, which takes you from the Overland Campaign, which happens in 1864, until the end of the war. Probably the most famous fictional work about the Civil War, though, is Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. People who've read The Red Badge of Courage and studied the Civil War quickly make the connection that the setting is the Battle of Chancellorsville, although Chancellorsville never actually gets mentioned in the book. What's interesting for our purposes is that Stephen Crane said he wrote The Red Badge of Courage so that he could understand what was going on in the hearts and minds of the soldiers who were there. And that's interesting because Michael Shaara, when he sort of like explains why he wrote The Killer Angels, he uses the exact explanation and refers the reader to Stephen Crane. All right, so let's look back. This is hopefully some refresher for you from your 9th grade American history class, but some of the things that caused this Civil War to come along. The first of them is differences between North and South, and I'm sure you know that in the North, you had a higher immigrant population working in an industrial setting. In the South, you had landowners and then people who worked the land. You had the slavery. So we've got economic and social differences between the two. The biggest of the economic differences comes from this whole idea of slavery. And if you've ever had anybody tell you that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights, pay attention to the next few things we're going to go over. States' rights were definitely important. The South was arguing that they had rights that the federal government was stepping on, but in all cases you can trace the issue involving the rights and what the North was doing and what the South was doing. You can trace that issue all the way back to slavery. So one of the earliest things was the Missouri Compromise, which was passed in 1818, took place in 1820, and the Missouri Compromise was not about whether slavery should continue to exist or not. It was really about the question of whether slavery should be allowed to expand. Cotton, and I have the cotton boll and branch there in the little graphic image, cotton is very hard on soil. And in the days before we fertilized and took care of our soil, southern growers of cotton realized that you could grow cotton very effectively on the same field for a few years, and then suddenly that field had nothing else to give. And so you're always looking for new lands and new territories for cotton. So when Missouri comes into the Union, the question is, will Missouri be a slave state or will Missouri be a free state? The compromise here was, well, we're going to let Missouri be a slave state, but to keep the balance of power in the Senate the same, we're going to create a free state to go along with. So at the same time in 1820, when Missouri was created as a slave state, the state of Maine, which had originally been part of Massachusetts, was cut off from Massachusetts, not physically, of course, but by maps, and it was allowed to come into the Union as a state, which was a free state. So yes, you allowed the expansion of slavery, but you didn't allow a greater pro-slavery voice in the United States Senate because, as you know, every state has 2 senators. So while 2 senators were added for Missouri in favor of slavery, 2 senators were added for Maine, and they would have, of course, opposed slavery. Later on then, you have the compromise, should really be called the Compromises of 1850. It was really 5 separate laws that involved slavery and trying to keep as many people happy as possible. For our purposes, the most important of these, however, was something called the Fugitive Slave Act. What the Fugitive Slave Act said was that if anyone had escaped from slavery and you knew about it, you had a responsibility to do your best to see that that person got turned in and returned to slavery. And this was true even if you lived in the North. So if you were a Pennsylvanian or you lived in Massachusetts or New York State and you had a neighbor that you realized had escaped from slavery, it was your responsibility to turn that person in. The problem with this law, the good thing I guess in this case, the problem was a good thing, was that nearly everyone in the free states ignored this law completely. One of the bad things about this law was it encouraged people who were known as slave catchers to come north, capture slaves, take them south, and collect a bounty. And in many times they were capturing people who had been born free in the North, and just because of their race, they were sending them south into slavery. Another thing that happens, and this shows you the power of writing fiction, a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was going to later on be Mark Twain's next door neighbor. She wrote this novel about the horrors of slavery. People in the North who had never seen plantation slavery firsthand read this novel. It was the best-selling book of its day. And it gave them the impression of how horrible slavery really was. You see, in the South, there were people known as apologists who spoke out and basically said that slavery was really a good thing, and that people brought from Africa, now living in the U.S., had a better life than they ever would have had before, and so don't feel bad about slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin showed the horrors. And there's an apocryphal story. Apocryphal means it's highly doubtful. Because, well, anyway, here's the story. The story is that Abraham Lincoln, during the war, met Harriet Beecher Stowe. And he said to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." We don't have any documentation that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, so we can't prove that this ever really happened. It's the kind of humor that Abraham Lincoln certainly was famous for. But it still shows you that people make the connection between the novel and those who stood to end slavery. Another thing from this time period that becomes really important is this thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Again, we have this question of our new states coming into the Union going to be slave or free. In Nebraska, it was decided it would be a free state. But Kansas was given this new idea called popular sovereignty. Let the people in Kansas vote. And what that did was it actually led to some of the bloodiest pre-war fighting. Sometime take a look at what happened in Lawrence, Kansas, when the pro-slavery raiders came into the town and they killed every male old enough to hold a gun. Old men, middle-aged men and boys, they killed them simply because if it's going to be a popular sovereignty issue, all you have to do is kill the people who would vote against you, and they can't vote against you. It was known as Bleeding Kansas, and I think you'll remember that name from your American history class. Then we had a famous Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken by his owner into free territory and then back into slave territory. And in the Dred Scott case, a number of abolitionists in the North got together and they decided to represent him in court. They were making the argument that the moment he was brought into free territory in a place where slavery was illegal, he couldn't have been a slave anymore. And so at that moment he was free and shouldn't have been taken back into slave territory. What actually happened was the Supreme Court in the case decided kind of two things. It was kind of complicated. One of the things they decided was that, well, the free territory he was taken into wasn't a state, it was a territory, and therefore the Supreme Court has no direct jurisdiction there. And then they argued also that because he is a slave, he had no right to bring a case before the Supreme Court anyway. The good thing, perhaps, for Dred Scott was those abolitionists were able to buy him his freedom. He worked for a number of years, saved money, bought the freedom of his family, but he died shortly after getting his freedom. He did not have a long life after he found his freedom. And then you probably remember talking about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This was for an Illinois Senate seat, and there were 9 debates. The text of the debates were published in newspapers. People read them. Lincoln lost that election. Stephen Douglas became the elected senator. But because many of the debates looked at the issue of slavery and the country and where we're headed, Lincoln caught the eye of people in this new political party called the Republican Party. And they decided that Lincoln might make a great leader for that particular party. And so it's because Lincoln actually lost the Senate seat that he's going to be nominated to run for president. And in a very crowded field, he gets elected in 1860 and he becomes the first Republican president in the history of the United States. Now the war breaks out. You probably know that the first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter. And one of the things that Abraham Lincoln wanted to happen was he wanted the Confederates to fire the first shots. Part of his belief was that it's easier to get the nation on your side in the case of a war if you've been the one who's been attacked. Firing first shots looks like an aggressive standpoint. And so Lincoln wanted the Confederates to fire first. One of the things that happened at Fort Sumter was the fort was basically cut off and surrounded by Confederates, even though it was garrisoned by Union soldiers. They needed supplies. So a ship, which was called the Star of the West, was sent with supplies to resupply the fort, and the Confederates fired upon that ship, not to sink it, they were warning shots, but they fired upon that ship to turn it around and send it back, and so now it became impossible to supply the soldiers who were there. The fort was under the command of Union Major Robert Anderson, and it was going to be attacked by General Pierre Gustave Toutant de Beauregard. Fortunately, we just call him PGT Beauregard, and his nickname was the Little Creole. As soon as these shots get fired on Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln now calls for 75,000 volunteers to join the Army on April 15th, 1861. Now, some people will tell you, oh, they were so naive. They thought that they could win this war with just 75,000 volunteers. What really was going on at this time was Congress was in recess, the president had limits on him, and 75,000 soldiers for a period of 3 months was the maximum he could ask for without congressional approval. Early in the war, you might remember talking about Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. Now, this is not Winfield Scott Hancock. This is not the character in The Killer Angels. Winfield Scott was the hero of the war in Mexico, and he's in charge of the U.S. Army at the start of the Civil War. His plan was to simply blockade all southern ports and not allow any goods to be shipped in or out of the Confederacy, and his belief was that this will take a long time, but with minimal loss of life, will be able to sort of, just as an anaconda, a big constricting snake would squeeze its prey, he believed that we could use the Union Army to squeeze the South. Now, a lot of people will tell you that from the very beginning, this war was a lost cause for the South, because the three things that are generally needed for warfare are machinery, and the factories are in the North, money. New York has already become the financial capital of the world, replacing London by this time with Wall Street, and manpower. And the population of people in the North is many, many times the population in the South. And so the Confederacy is going to go into this war sort of in the hole when it comes to, possessing these three necessaries. This is a picture of the inside of Fort Sumter, but it's a picture that was taken in 1865, so it was taken after the war was over. And I can just kind of point out, if you look at the inside of the walls of the fort, you see what look like baskets or barrels piled up everywhere. One of the things we quickly learned in this war was that stone forts don't work very well against modern cannons. The cannon shells just simply shatter the rocks. And so using a French technique, forts later on were reinforced or even constructed using these baskets. So they're wicker baskets. You make gigantic barrel-sized wicker baskets, and then you fill them with sand, and those are called gabions. And what they found was soft walls for forts absorb the shots. Hard walls shatter. Anyway, just a little piece of trivia. Now, as I said, for the start of the Battle of Fort Sumter, it was under the command of Colonel Robert Anderson, and outside the fort attacking using his artillery was PGT Beauregard. I'm just going to throw two ironies at you, because one of the things we're looking at in our Killer Angels unit is how storytelling exists in the natural world. And one of the things we love, I mean, when have you ever read a short story that didn't feature irony at some point? One of the things that we love about the Killer Angels is the irony, the odd twists of what was going on at this time. One of the ironies here is that Beauregard is going to use his artillery to destroy the fort and secure the surrender of Robert Anderson. What's unusual about this is that at the start of the war, Robert Anderson was the artillery instructor at West Point, and one of his students was Beauregard. So Beauregard used the tools he learned from his teacher to defeat his teacher. Sometimes students do grow up, actually many times students grow up to be far better than their instructors. Another irony about this one here is that during the whole siege of Fort Sumter, there were no deaths. And then when the fort was surrendered and the Union soldiers marched out in order to pay tribute to them, as the American flag was coming down, a cannon was set off. That cannon exploded and killed some of the people operating it. So if they hadn't had the ceremony, there would have been no deaths at Fort Sumter. All right, in the first year of the war, 1861, Abraham Lincoln needs a very capable commander to give control of the Union Army, and that person that he picks is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, we talked about before, had an incredible reputation thanks to his efforts in the war in Mexico and his time at West Point, and so he's offered this. Robert E. Lee believes that Virginia is where a lot of the fighting is going to take place. He sees himself as a Virginian first and an American second. That was not uncommon in those days. And so the only thing he can do is resign his commission. He can't just say, no, I don't want to do this, Mr. Commander-in-Chief. And so he resigns his commission from the Army. The first battle of the war, total confusion. In the South, it's called the Battle of First Manassas because it took place at Manassas Junction, just west of Washington, D.C. In the North, it's called the First Battle of Bull Run. My usual policy is if the war was won by the North, I will use the names that the battle was given in the North. If it was won by the South, I will use the names that it was given by the Confederates. So we're going to call this First Manassas. It was July 16th, 1861. And you notice that here's Beauregard. His reputation has helped him come to command of the Confederate forces at this time. and in command of the armies for the Union is General Irvin McDowell. This battle was a complete mess. And so, for instance, like, we often think of in the North they wore blue and in the South they wore gray. Well, the Confederate uniform hasn't even come along yet. The Southern armies are wearing all kinds of uniforms. Many of them are still wearing their blue uniforms that they were issued by the Army before they left the Union Army to join the Confederate Army. Some of them are militia groups dressed as if they're in the American Revolution. Now, it's at this battle that Stonewall Jackson, we talked about him, he's dead by the time we get to Gettysburg. It's where he gets his nickname Stonewall, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But this battle is going to be an absolute disaster for the North. They're going to end up retreating, and they're going to run all the way back to Washington, D.C. Sometimes this battle gets called the Great Skedaddle because they just ran. What else is really unusual about this battle is everybody thought that the Confederate Army was going to simply be crushed. And so citizens, not soldiers, citizens from Washington, D.C., packed up picnic baskets. They got into their carriages, and ladies and men went out to have picnics and sat on the high ground to watch the battle, as if it were some kind of Super Bowl game. And when the Union Army had to retreat, these people ran. And so as the Army's retreating, they're also, the same roads are being shared by civilians who are running for their lives to get back to Washington, D.C. Nobody took this war seriously enough. They thought it was just going to be over and done with at the start. Now, things go so bad at the end of this that Irvin McDowell gets replaced by Abraham Lincoln, and General George B. McClellan is going to take command of the Army of the Potomac. Another thing that happened in 1861, which bears on some of the discussions that happen in the Killer Angels, is something called the Trent Affair. There's this question of whether or not the British would enter this war. And if they entered the war, would they come in on the side of the Confederacy? Now, some people will argue yes, but by this point in history, Parliament is so against slavery, it's highly unlikely that the British government would have actually entered the war on the side of the Confederacy to help them fight for that particular cause. Now, that didn't keep them from selling munitions, from selling ships and weapons to the South throughout the war. But if there was one event that might have brought the British into the war, it was this thing called the Trent Affair. What happened, short version of the Trent Affair, was that two Confederate diplomats had been picked up by the British ship Trent, and they were going to Britain, perhaps to negotiate some deals. A Union warship stopped, on the high seas, stopped the British ship Trent, boarded it, and captured these two Confederate diplomats. Now, for one country to stop another country's ships at sea, board them, and take somebody off, can easily be considered in itself an act of war. And so if it hadn't been for a few months of careful negotiations between the Lincoln administration and the British government, it might very well have been that the British could have come into the war on the side of the South. During this time, 1861, sometimes we think that it wasn't until the Battle of Sharpsburg that Confederate troops made it into the North. But during this time, Jeb Stuart, major character in the Killer Angels, is in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And Chambersburg is where Lee is going to have his entire Army central camp at the start of the novel that we are reading. All right, just a couple quick things. That was the only picture I could find, a period picture from the time of the Battle of First Manassas. That house was called the Robinson House, and it was near the spot where Stonewall Jackson got his nickname Stonewall. The story goes that there was a Confederate brigadier general named Bernard B. He had been wounded. I think it was a stomach wound from a Union shell, and he was going to die. He's not going to live through the Battle of Manassas. But things aren't looking good at that particular moment for the Confederates. And he was heard to shout out, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." And so Stonewall Jackson's brigade, when he said "there stands Jackson," he doesn't mean Jackson personally, he means Jackson's troops, There they stand like a stone wall. They became after that known as the Stonewall Brigade, and Jackson known as Stonewall Jackson. Jackson always hated this name. And there's some controversy. There are some historians who argue that the wounded and dying bee was actually angry that Jackson wasn't doing more. And so on one argument, you can say that Jackson should be doing something, but instead he's standing like a stone wall. The other side of the argument is this man is holding his ground against the enemy, and he's doing it just like a stone wall. So we really, I mean, you can get in some pretty heated arguments today with those people who argue on one side of that issue or another. All right, so as I said, Abraham Lincoln chooses George McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac after this. George McClellan is a Pennsylvanian, comes from a very wealthy Pennsylvania family. He's a brilliant student. He entered the University of Pennsylvania, thank you, Benjamin Franklin, entered the University of Pennsylvania at just age 13. It wasn't terribly uncommon for students to start university by age 16 at this time. But even at 16, 13 is very young. And he entered West Point to get his military training a whole year under the required age. I don't know how that exactly happened, but you were supposed to be 16 before you could start, and he started at 15. He was an excellent student, graduated second in his class while he was there. And a lot of people will blame George McClellan for his cautiousness in the early days of the war, and there's no question he was cautious, but his contributions shouldn't be overlooked. One of the things he did was he built and trained the Army of the Potomac. And remember, this is an army made up of volunteers. These are citizens who've suddenly become soldiers. One of the things he did was he brought sanitary conditions to the army. And most of you probably know that more soldiers died of infection during the 4 years of Civil War than were killed outright on the battlefield. And so these kinds of sanitary conditions are incredibly important. And then, like I said, he's going to command the army, he's going to be relieved, and then he's going to come back for a while. Lincoln definitely knew that this man had the ability to do well as commander of the army. The problem, of course, was that he was cautious. He always wanted more soldiers. He always waited. He had a lot of spies who informed him that the enemy's numbers were well beyond his, and so he wouldn't attack. He was often fooled by something called Quaker guns. What the Confederates would do at a distance, you got to remember, at a distance in those days, field glasses, binoculars, didn't have the clarity like modern day, lenses, and they would literally take trees, cut them down, and then paint them black and make them look like cannons. And so from a distance, sometimes these spies would report back they have 40 cannons trained on, the field. And they weren't really cannons. They were just simply what were called Quaker guns. Quakers, Quakers from early Pennsylvania history, they were pacifists. They didn't believe in war. And so these were the kinds of guns that pacifists would use. They're not guns. They're just simply tree trunks painted black. And then one of McClellan's downfalls was he couldn't keep his mouth shut sometimes when he ought to. And he came from a very wealthy, well-educated Pennsylvania family. He saw Abraham Lincoln as this backwoods hick. You remember, Lincoln was an autodidact. He educated himself. He's famous for that today. But McClellan called the President of the United States a baboon repeatedly and in public. And eventually the President is going to have to step and do something about this. By 1864, McClellan is out of the Army. He's been relieved of command by Abraham Lincoln, and he actually runs on the Democratic ticket. And the Democrats at this time were known as Copperheads, and Copperheads wanted to just simply end the war. Let's have two countries, let's make peace, and let's work with the Confederacy to, negotiate trade deals and things like that. McClellan was loved by the Army, and so it would be sensible that soldiers would vote for him. But the reality is, in 1864, long after the Killer Angels, when it came time to vote, soldiers didn't want to give up by that point. They had fought for up to 3 years. They had, and some of them even more, but they had fought for 3 years, and they saw their friends die for a cause, and now to simply make peace and end that effort seemed like it was turning it into a failure. And so, ironically, the Democrats they nominated McClellan thinking that the soldiers would vote for him because the soldiers loved him, but the soldiers instead stood with the idea of cause. And again, that ties to the Killer Angels, because many times when you hear characters talking in this novel, you're going to hear them talking about why they are fighting. This is always going to be cause with a capital C in this novel. All right, what about the second year of the war? The second year of the war, the North is going to see its first victories, but they're going to be in the Western theater. And they're going to be with those armies who are being commanded by this relatively unknown guy named Ulysses Grant. The battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh are going to be victories in the North. They're going to make Grant a household name. There's also going to be the Battle of Shiloh is going to be the bloodiest single fighting day in American history to that point. And that mark is going to be passed several times in the rest of the war. By the way, as I said, sometimes battles have different names, South and North. In the North, the Battle of Shiloh was known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. Another famous battle is a sea battle between two ships, the Monitor and the Virginia. Now you might have heard it sometimes as a battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack. These were both ironclad ships. This is the first battle ever between two iron ships. The USS Monitor, sometimes called a cheese box on a raft, looks almost like a submarine, floated very low in the water, had a revolving turret with guns in it, could shoot in any direction regardless of which direction the ship was facing in. The Virginia had once been the Merrimack. See, the Merrimack was a Union ship that was scuttled. Scuttled means that if you think your ship is going to fall into enemy hands, you destroy your own ship so the enemy can't get it. And the Union soldiers had burned the Merrimack. But a ship sometimes only burns down to the waterline. And the hull was saved by the Confederates. The ship was refitted, recommissioned as a Confederate ship, and it was named the Virginia. So by the time the battle came along, it was not the Monitor and the Merrimack. It was the Monitor and the Virginia. This was a stalemate. These ships pounded one another all day long at Hampton Roads, Virginia, and then they sailed off in different directions. And I don't know the name of the newspaper, but there was a London newspaper who, upon hearing of this battle, wrote something like, yesterday the British Navy had X number of first-class warships. Today it has none, because they realized that all wooden warships had instantly become obsolete. That same year, you have something called the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan has the idea of landing soldiers by ship at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula that lies between the James and the, it's the James and is it the Rappahannock River? I'd have to take a look at a map quickly. But anyway, between these two rivers, fighting up the river and going towards Richmond. This is the same peninsula where Jamestown exists. It's the same peninsula where Williamsburg exists. And so many of you have probably even vacationed there at some point. It's going to be a success up until the end. McClellan's going to fight his way all the way up the peninsula, get within reasonable range of Richmond, and then pick up a defensive position and end up fighting his way back down the peninsula, loading his troops back onto ships and giving up that territory. After this, Henry Halleck is going to be promoted to command of all the Union forces. We'll talk about him in a second. And it's also at Second Manassas, same place as First Manassas 1 year later, that again, the Union Army is going to be crushed. This time it's Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet. Lee is in command of the entire Confederate army here, and then it's got the two corps. Jackson has one, Longstreet has the other, and we've already talked about after Jackson's death, Jackson's corps is going to be divided into two more corps. After the Battle of Second Manassas, Lincoln decides, well, maybe things were better with McClellan, and he puts him back in command of that army, but not of all the armies. All the armies, as I said, are in command of this guy named Henry Halleck. Now, Henry Halleck had some odd little behaviors. He had the nickname Old Brains. He was known as being incredibly intelligent and a great strategist. And whenever he would think, he had this habit of crossing his arms and scratching his elbows. And soldiers used to joke around that he was stimulating his brain, that his brain actually was in his elbows. He did not like, perhaps because of Grant's success and perhaps because of the rumors that were being spread about Grant as a drinker. And that's a whole other story in itself we're not going to get into. But he investigated Grant, he distrusted him, and he actually relieved him of command, this General Grant who was having successes. Abraham Lincoln makes Henry Halleck General-in-Chief of all the United States armies, but he chooses to command from Washington, D.C. He's not out in the field. And from Washington, he tries to micromanage his field commanders. They simply ignored him sometimes because they felt that he didn't have a good perspective of what was going on. Still, he's going to be General Meade's direct superior as Meade is fighting at Gettysburg. And so Meade has to communicate with Washington, D.C. and his superior by using couriers on horseback, and when he can, by using this new thing called the telegraph. Lincoln didn't have the highest perspective, I guess, by the end about Henry Halleck, and Lincoln was known to describe Halleck as being a great clerk. In other words, this is somebody who was great with numbers and paperwork and planning, but he was not the kind of active soldier in the field kind of guy. And eventually, after the Battle of Gettysburg and Grant becomes promoted to the same position that Halleck has, Grant's going to command the forces from the field, not from Washington, D.C. And Grant realizes that Halleck has potential. And so this guy who once kind of like removed Grant from command actually gets a position under Grant as his chief of staff. So again, Grant is one of these guys who doesn't just simply remove somebody because I disagree with you. He looks for the best people and puts them on his staff. In fact, it's kind of interesting that when Grant died, Henry Halleck, who once removed Grant from command, is one of the pallbearers for Lincoln. So politics is politics, but in the end, I think these soldiers did what was right. Again, in the second year of the war, 1862, coming into the fall, you're going to face the bloodiest battle in American history, and it remains the bloodiest single-day battle in American history to this day. It takes place at the town of Sharpsburg in Maryland. So in the south, they call it the Battle of Sharpsburg. In the north, they call it the Battle of Antietam. There are three aspects to this battle, and I'm sure you've heard of the cornfield, the sunken road, also known as Bloody Lane, and the battle at Burnside's Bridge. But to this day, as I said, it is still the bloodiest day in U.S. history, with 23,000 casualties in a single day. The good thing is, this was a battle in which Robert E. Lee had brought his army into the north, and the Union Army was able to turn Lee back, send him south again. Ambrose Powell Hill, a character in the Killer Angels, becomes a hero this day. At this battle, Robert E. Lee almost got captured, and A.P. Hill rushes troops all the way from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's West Virginia now, but it was still Virginia at that time. Rushes troops from Harper's Ferry all the way to Sharpsburg in order to arrive just in time to save Robert E. Lee. And another Union soldier becomes famous at this time, a guy by the name of Ambrose Burnside. And because he's successful fighting here in this one-day battle, he's going to get an opportunity in a moment for a promotion as well. After the Battle of Antietam and turning Lee's army back, Abraham Lincoln finally believes, I have enough of a major victory that I am going to release the Emancipation Proclamation. So one day later, Abraham Lincoln makes it known that this proclamation is coming. It doesn't take effect until January 1st, 1863, but people have a chance to read this ahead of time. And this is Lincoln's first attempt to do something to end slavery in the South. All right, real quickly, let's take a quick look. I'm using maps that are in the public domain from the Wikipedia Commons here. And so here are the two battle lines at the Battle of Antietam. You can see the Confederates on the left side of the map, Union on the right. The Union strategy was we outnumber the Confederates several times over. Let's just simply attack along the entire line and crush them. And so here's the Union line, and the idea was a coordinated effort to attack the entire Confederate line. Unfortunately, communication was not that good, and what happens is the battle in the north occurs first. This is the area around Dunker Church and the cornfield. Confederates are allowed to move troops to reinforce, and the attack is not successful. The middle part of the day, the fighting occurs at this area called the Sunken Road. Today we call it Bloody Lane. It's a natural kind of like indentation in the ground. It's like digging a trench, but it's already there. And it's going to be in Confederate hands and Union hands and Confederate hands. And literally this trench began to fill with bodies as the day's fighting went on. And late in the day, the fighting happens in the southern part of the battlefield where there are bridges that cross the Antietam Creek towards some high ground held by the Confederates. And this is the only part of the battle that's going to be successful for the Union Army during that day, but it's enough to drive Robert E. Lee from these grounds. And shortly after, the next day, they will start to pull out and move back into Virginia. We have photographs from this battle, not active photographs during the battle because it took too long to set a camera up for action shots, but Alexander Gardner, who was trained in photography under Matthew Brady, took his cameras and a staff of people to Antietam, and they photographed the dead on the battlefield before they could be buried. In some rather unethical kind of actions, it's known that Alexander Gardner and his team sometimes moved the dead, posed them sometimes to get better shots. But what they did was then they took their photographs and they went to New York City and they put on an exhibition called The Dead of Antietam. And it was the first time that civilians really saw the horrors of war up front. So the image that you're looking right now is of a church. It was called the Dunker Church. Dunkers or Dunkards were a religious sect, and you see the woods behind it. The Confederates had those woods as their cover, and kind of like from the photographer's standpoint, if you could just turn around and look directly behind you, you would find the cornfields. So the Union troops attacked through the cornfields towards these woods that day. And again, this was the early part of the fighting. Bloody Lane, this is I know this is a gruesome image. It's very much like images you might have seen from the liberation of the concentration camps during the Holocaust. But this was Bloody Lane. This was once just a road, and it was used there. There are Confederate dead and Union dead in this pit through the day. This was the middle part of the day, the middle part of the battle. And towards evening, there was fighting here at what became known as Burnside's Bridge. And in this particular image from the 19th century, you see the Confederates on the right, and if you continued on the right beyond the limits of this picture, you would go up the hill to the high ground. The Union troops had to cross the creek at that bridge and then get back into formation. The bridge still exists today. This is again a 19th century photograph, but this bridge is still there. It's taken care of by the National Park Service. It's preserved. And what's interesting is this particular tree is much bigger today, but it's still alive. It's what we call a witness tree. Witness trees are trees on our national battlefields who were around at the time of the battle and are still around today. And so if you go to the Antietam battlefield, which is a national park, you can go to Burnside's Bridge and you can see this tree, which is marked with a plaque as a witness tree. Again, More photographs by Alexander Gardner. You see the new grave with the board to mark the name of the dead. These boards were used whenever they knew the name of someone who had died, but there was no such thing as a dog tag at this time. So unless a soldier was carrying identity, we often could not identify the dead, and they went into the ranks of the unknowns. Shortly after the Battle of Sharpsburg, Abraham Lincoln hopped on a train from Washington, D.C. and rode out to meet with McClellan to negotiate. And this is a famous Alexander Gardner photograph of Abraham Lincoln in McClellan's tent talking together. And outside McClellan's tent, I've clipped this one, it's just partial. This is the only photograph I've ever seen of a standing Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, to this day, is still our tallest president at 6 feet 4 inches tall. If you've seen Donald Trump standing next to people, you can see he's quite tall, but Donald Trump is only 6 feet 2 inches. So Abraham Lincoln is still the tallest at 6 feet 4. In the second year of the war, then, it continues to the end of the war at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Fredericksburg is now south of Washington, D.C., north of Richmond. It's between the two cities. And on December 13th, the battle is going to happen. In command of the Union Army is General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside is that guy who made his fame at that bridge at the Battle of Antietam that's now named for him. He wanted to attack Fredericksburg sooner, but to do so, he's got to get across the Rappahannock River. And the bridges have all been destroyed, and so this means we need pontoon bridges. Pontoons were boats that could be floated and anchored in the river, and then a roadbed could be laid across those, and you cover that with dirt to protect the wood from the metal of the horses' hooves and the metal wagon wheels and things, and you can cross. But those pontoons were delayed and delayed and delayed, and now it's winter. And the armies almost never fought in wintertime. They simply went into camp and waited for the winter to end because we didn't have paved roads, and roads became very muddy, and you couldn't move armies. Horses would sink in the muddy roads up, to their ankles, and so you just had to wait. So it's going to be very unusual that we're going to have a winter battle here on December 13th. The pontoons, which were delayed, finally arrived, and the bridges are built under Confederate fire across this. The Union troops are going to have to cross the river, fight their way through town, and then fight uphill to where the Confederates are dug in, and in many places behind a natural stone wall. Now, this features into the novel because Chamberlain is here. He's still the lieutenant colonel of the 20th Maine. Ames is still the colonel, but they are at Marie's Heights. And this is the place where Chamberlain is going to spend the night sleeping on the battlefield, piling up dead bodies to use as protection against the bullets, often from sharpshooters, that are still coming at them that night. So this is going to play in, and Chamberlain's going to think about this. If any character thinks a lot in the novel, it's Chamberlain. And so Michael Shaara has taken what he knows happened to Chamberlain at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and he's going to bring it into his character as he creates that character for the fictional work that we're reading. This battle at Fredericksburg is also going to be the last time that Lee, Longstreet, and Jackson are going to be together. After this, Longstreet is going to be sent off in another direction. Jackson's going to be killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in the spring, and so this is the last time they're together. The Confederate losses for this battle, 5,300. Union losses are going to be more than 12,000. Now that's absolutely huge. You got to remember, though, that Confederate losses, even when they're lower than federal losses, often hurt more because the Confederate Army is smaller to begin with. So a smaller number could still be a bigger percentage of the Army. Here's General Burnside. You might notice something about that crazy beard he's wearing. His name's Burnside because of the way he chose to wear his whiskers. We call those side whiskers sideburns. And so the reversing of the two parts of his name, Burnside, sideburns, there's something we actually get from this guy that stays around today. He made this direct assault up the hill towards the stone wall. It failed multiple times. Ultimately, he threatened to hop on a horse and lead it himself. And And then after he loses this war, he decides, you know what, it's still winter. Let's try to march around that Confederate army and attack them from behind. Remember what I told you about winter and roads? It became known as the Mud March. He absolutely could not move his army. He finally retreated back, and they stayed on Stafford Heights across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg for the rest of that winter. He's later on in the war, this is after the Killer Angels, he's going to try and attack at Petersburg, Virginia, where he's going to have soldiers from Pennsylvania, miners from the Pennsylvania coalfields, are going to literally dig a mine underneath the Confederates at one point and try to blow them up. For a number of reasons, it should have worked, but it was a complete failure, mostly because of political decisions that were made, and he resigns his command at that point. Later on, he goes on to be elected governor of Rhode Island, and when the National Rifle Association is formed, he becomes their first president. After the war was over and General Grant had served 2 terms as president, Grant was dying of cancer while he was writing his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he said of Ambrose Burnside, he said he was not fitted to command an army. No one knew this better than himself. Grant praised Burnside as being someone who could follow orders and make those orders happen, but as someone who had to come up with the orders on his own, Grant realized he was not the guy. And for whether Grant was right or not, he says Burnside knew this, and maybe that's why he resigned. Now, this is another 19th century image of soldiers building those pontoon bridges to be able to cross the Rappahannock River and attack the town of Fredericksburg, which they've been shelling with large artillery from the heights for quite a while at this point. Real quickly, again, another Wikipedia Commons map. These maps are accurate enough, and like I said, they're in the public domain, so I can use them here. You see Stafford Heights, that was where the Union camp was. You see that they need to cross the river, fight their way through town, and then it is all uphill to that red line where the Confederates are dug in behind that stone wall. And so, again, here's Stafford Heights. Move across the river, fight your way through town, and then come up into the open ground here where you're under fire. This is the area where Chamberlain had to spend that night on the field, sleeping on the battlefield while Confederate shots are still coming in at them. They're protected only from gullies they can find, natural gullies that exist in the field. Here's shortly after the battle, a picture. This is from Stafford Heights, from the Union side of the Rappahannock River, looking at the town of Fredericksburg, and then some pictures of the town after the shelling. So you can see it's not really much of a town at this point. If you go all the way up the hill, you go through the town and you go all the way up the hill, you'll find to this day this building. This was called Marie House. Robert E. Lee used it as his headquarters. It's still there today. It's not open to the public. It's privately owned. It's on the campus of Martha Washington University, and this building actually gets used by whoever the current president of Martha Washington University. So that's why you can't tour it. It's actually someone's home to this day. And again, some period pictures of preparing to bury the dead. All right, now we're up to the year of the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. At the start of the year, Lincoln puts Joseph Hooker in command. Now, he got the nickname Fighting Joe. Ironically, that was because of a mistake in a newspaper. The headline was supposed to read, "Fighting. Joe Hooker is blah, 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 blah." And instead, the punctuation was missing. The headline read, "Fighting Joe Hooker," and he became known as Fighting Joe Hooker. But he's given command of the Army of the Potomac at the start of the year. Meanwhile, in the West, Grant has now begun the siege of Vicksburg. If the Confederates lose Vicksburg, they lose the Mississippi River. And if they lose the Mississippi River, they lose all ability to get supplies to the heart of the Confederacy by water. It's going to be a terrible blow. And so what Grant is doing at Vicksburg during 1863 is as important as anything that was done during the entire Civil War. All right, now, the Battle of Chancellorsville, it's May of 1863. Gettysburg is July of 1863. So you're looking at just about 2 months before Gettysburg, this battle is going on. Hooker has a great plan. Hooker's plan is we're going to leave some troops in Stafford Heights, make Robert E. Lee believe we're staying here, but we're going to secretly move troops all the way out and around and attack Lee from behind. Lee's going to make a gamble. I'll show you on some maps in just a second. Jackson's going to make an even bigger gamble. All right, we're going to see Daniel Sickles, who's mentioned as the bully boy in Gettysburg. He's going to learn a lesson that may help us explain why he disobeyed orders at Gettysburg. And we're going to see Robert E. Lee get his greatest victory of the war and perhaps become a little overconfident for his next battle, which is going to be Gettysburg. So let's take a quick look at what's going on. But let's meet Hooker first of all. So Hooker is a guy who got a reputation fighting in again, the Indian Wars, just like John Buford had done. He fought in the wars against the Seminole Indians. He previously commanded the 5th Corps. Why is that important? Well, the 5th Corps is Chamberlain's Corps. The 5th Corps is the same corps that was later commanded by Meade, who's going to be in command at Gettysburg. The 5th Corps provided 2 commanders for the Army of the Potomac. Now, unfortunately, Hooker is one of these guys who doesn't necessarily pick the best people to be on his staff, but he picks his buddies. He picks his friends. He picks the ones that support him. One of these is Dan Butterfield. And Dan Butterfield gets mentioned in the Killer Angels. Perhaps you've already read the scene where Tom Chamberlain is marching along on the way from Hanover, and he's talking about how Butterfield had written bugle commands and wrote a special bugle command for the 20th Maine. It's the one that it goes Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. And so for whatever it's worth, I tried to make connections to the Killer Angels here. One of the other things Hooker's going to do, and I'll show these to you, is he actually helps organize a little bit. He creates corps insignia, badges that soldiers can wear to show which Army Corps they're in and which division of that Army Corps they're in. It helps clear things up on the battlefield of where a soldier should be. And number 2, it creates a little bit of a sense of pride among the soldiers, almost a sense of teamwork. And then Hooker could, there's no question, Hooker could have won the Battle of Chancellorsville, but he suddenly turns super cautious, changes his plan midway through, and allows Robert E. Lee to get the upper hand. Now, in his defense, Hooker was wounded. A shell went off very near him, he received a concussion, and I suppose that perhaps after a concussion you don't think as clearly as you were before the battle. But let me go back to those corps insignia, because this is kind of cool. So you need to know, like if you've been in Boy Scouts or anything like that, you wear insignia to show which Boy Scout troop you're in. You sew it on your shoulder. Today, if you're in any branch of the armed forces, you're going to wear some insignia that shows what group you're attached to. And you see, in the time of the Civil War, a soldier could run away from his unit, show up anywhere on the battlefield, and say that he was supposed to be there. So these corps badges are going to help with organization, but they're also going to create a sense of teamwork and pride of this is the group I'm with. Let me show you what they are real quickly here. So this simple circle is going to be used by the 1st Corps. And if it's a red circle, that's 1st Division. The white circle is 2nd Division, and the blue circle is 3rd Division. So you've got red, white, and blue within each of the Army Corps. So the circle is going to be the 1st Corps, and then we have the 2nd, said that wrong, the 11th Corps. Jumped ahead here. The 11th Corps is the 2nd Corps to arrive at Gettysburg, and they're going to wear this crescent shape. And then we have the 5th Corps, which is Chamberlain's, and sometimes this is known as the Maltese Cross. So you'll see this shape used other times with various military groups. You have the Second Corps under Hancock. This looks like a club, like from a deck of cards, properly known as a trefoil. French again, the three leaves trefoil. And then you have Daniel Sickles in his Sixth Corps, uses this diamond shape. You have the largest corps. They're not going to figure into the Killer Angels, but the largest corps at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg is going to be the Sixth Corps. Some of them fought, but most of the corps was held in reserve. So when some people say, oh, if only the Confederates could have broken through at Gettysburg, they would have won, they're forgetting that the Sixth Corps was waiting right there. And then we also have the Ninth Corps under Henry Slocum. And they're going to be fighting in that northern part of the Union line, which is a really important aspect to the Battle of Gettysburg, but it does not figure into the Killer Angels, so we won't be discussing that at all. All right, so Battle of Chancellorsville. You notice this map looks an awful lot like the map we had for the Battle of Fredericksburg, because Fredericksburg plays into this. So everything starts out with the Union Army here across the river from Fredericksburg, and what's going to happen is the Union Army is going to start fighting again. It's springtime now, the winter's over, start fighting as if they're trying to capture the town of Fredericksburg, but many of the Union Army are going to move out and around the Confederate Army and try to get in behind the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee, in a very daring move with a small army, is going to divide his army. He's going to keep soldiers at Fredericksburg and send the rest west to meet the Union Army before they have a time to get behind Fredericksburg. Now, dividing an army in those days was a risky business. Dividing a small army is even riskier. And once part of Robert E. Lee's army, the biggest part of it, is out west of Fredericksburg, out near Chancellorsville, we have Stonewall Jackson, who's going to come up with a plan. I'm going to divide the army even one more time. And with some local guides, he's going to take his men on a forced march out along the Brock Road and some other tiny country roads and attack the Union Army from behind. Hooker, by this point, has become cautious. The 11th Corps is going to be surprised. They're still setting up their camp and preparing for dinner when these Confederates come out of the woods and attack them, and they just pick up and run in a panic. The entire Union line rolls up, and once again, the Union Army retreats. Robert E. Lee gets his most unlikely victory here. Now, just another picture here. This is in Fredericksburg on Marie's Heights, behind that stone wall that was so hard to attack back on December 13th, 1863. But after the Battle of Fredericksburg, this is what it looks like here. So you can kind of see that the soldiers dug in even a little bit more as they were behind this stone wall. By the way, I don't know if you can see it, but in the distance you see a very small house. There was a widow who lived in that house, and she refused to leave. She stayed in that house between the Union and Confederate lines during the battles, and even though her house is riddled with bullet holes, she managed to live. All right, so now we're very, very close to the Battle of Gettysburg. I'll bet you thought we'd never get here, but we are in the month before Gettysburg, and in a place, it was a supply depot down in Virginia, a place known as Brandy Station. Stuart rides in, he shows off his cavalry to the locals, and then the Union cavalry attacks him, and there's going to be a big cavalry battle here. Remember, cavalry means soldiers on horseback. Up to this point, every time Union cavalry fought Southern cavalry proved to be superior. That is not going to be the case here. And by the end of the day, it's really a standoff. It's not a Union victory. It's not a clear Confederate victory. But Stuart does not get the victory that he expected, and his reputation is tarnished. And so, by the way, this is kind of an interesting thing. If you visit there, it's just a small place. It's not anything with a visitor center or anything like that, but there are plaques placed around the area that show you what happened where. Some of those plaques were placed by a group called Daughters of the Confederacy. and they have a little bit of a reputation of not always telling the truth. And if you read the plaques put out by the National Park Service, you will read that this was a standoff between the two cavalries. If you read the plaques that were put there by the Daughters of the Confederacy, they tell you about the amazing and wonderful victory that Stuart pulled off at that time. Well, it's right after this that George Meade is going to be appointed command of the Army of the Potomac by the end of the month. Now remember, Gettysburg starts on July 1st. Meade is appointed on June 28th. He's going to fight the most costly battle of the entire war, and he's only going to have 2 days to get ready to do this. Now, what's going on at this time? Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is moving from Virginia into Pennsylvania. They're going to spread out through Pennsylvania. They have several purposes in being here. One of them is to invade the North, to possibly threaten Harrisburg, possibly threaten Washington, D.C., to fight a battle in Northern Territory so that people in the North who are in favor of the war might change their minds a bit. But one of his other key strategies here is his army's hungry. They need food. They need clothing. They need horses. And they need money. And so one of the things Robert E. Lee is doing is something called foraging. His army is spread out and they're taking goods from northern towns in Pennsylvania. Now, they pay for everything they take, but they pay in Confederate currency, which is going to be worth absolutely nothing when the war is over. At this same time, the Army of the Potomac moves from Virginia to Frederick, Maryland. Frederick, Maryland is south of Gettysburg, just across the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. And Meade would really like to fight a battle here. He's digging in along Pipe Creek, but it's not going to happen. Now, at this same time, General Stuart, and you know this from the Killer Angels, he's missing. He's been foraging himself, looking for supplies, making raids in the North, but he ends up finding himself cut off from his own army. He's got the entire Union Army between him and Robert E. Lee. So again, another Wikipedia map. If you take a look at this here, let me go back one here, sorry. If you take a look at this here, I've circled the mountains. Robert E. Lee takes his army through a mountain pass. You can't cross a mountain with an army in those days. When you look at a Confederate cannon hooked to its caisson and all of the horses, you have something as long as a school bus, and many times 8 horses. You simply can't go up over mountaintops. You've got to find the places where you have the gaps in the mountain ranges. And so Robert E. Lee's going to go through the gap, and he's going to head north through the valley to get into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, you have the Union Army to the east, and you have Stuart even farther east than that. Stuart is threatening Washington, D.C. He's making raids, but if you notice at this map, you have the entire Union Army moving between Stuart and his own army. And so he's going to be missing for the first day and a half at Gettysburg. Alrighty, so in that last bit of time leading up to Gettysburg, what do we have going on? Jubal Early, the guy that Robert E. Lee calls my bad old man, he's moving from York, Pennsylvania, which has been captured by Confederates, into Wrightsville, Pennsylvania. We'll talk about that with some pictures I have coming up later. You have ironworks. Ironworks were being used at this time to make cannons. In Caledonia, Pennsylvania, you have some ironworks that were owned by Thaddeus Stevens, Pennsylvania senator. And Jubal Early goes out of his way to destroy these ironworks, partly because it's destroying some of the war effort in New York, and partly because they hate this abolitionist, Thaddeus Stevens. You're also going to have some skirmishes going on in Gettysburg. So the idea that there were shoes in Gettysburg and the Confederates were just arriving doesn't make sense. Confederates have been in Gettysburg, and skirmishes are small battles. They've been having some small battles with Union soldiers. The city of York actually surrendered and the Wrightsville Bridge was destroyed, but again, I'm going to get back to that. I have some pictures for you for that later on. Robert Ewell seizes the town of Carlisle, and so things aren't looking good. The city of York in Pennsylvania is under a Confederate flag. The Confederates are working to make their way across to Lancaster County. Ewell has seized the city of Carlisle. And the important thing about Carlisle is the Carlisle Barracks are there. That is one of the large Union training facilities for soldiers. And that gets destroyed. And so it's not looking good for the North at this point. But right at this point, shots are fired at the Battle of Gettysburg. And on July 1st, all rebel forces who are spread out across Pennsylvania must come back to Gettysburg. Now, why Gettysburg? What makes Gettysburg so important? Well, here's kind of the best map I could find at this point. And you'll notice, this large circle that I have here, Confederate troops and Union troops, they're all over the place. You need to concentrate them. You need to bring your army back together. You can't bring troops and we're talking, 50,000 soldiers. You can't bring them in along a single wagon trail. You've got to find many roads that all converge at the same point. And here in Gettysburg, we have no less than 10 roads all converge at this one point. And so both armies choose Gettysburg as a converging point. Now, this is not related to the Killer Angels, but it's a great story, and some of you guys, when you do your own research and stories later on, might be interested in this. So the Susquehanna River is about a mile wide between the Lancaster County town and the across the river, the town of Wrightsville on the York County side. And at the time of the battle, there was a covered bridge that went across this river. Some say it was the longest covered bridge in the entire world. And it was quite an engineering marvel. You could take a train across it. You couldn't pull the engine. Well, I'm sorry, I should say that again. You couldn't run the engine across the bridge. You had to pull it across because it was a covered bridge and you didn't want embers from the coal-burning engine to burn your bridge down. But you could take your train across the bridge. The other thing you could do, you could walk across it, you could take wagons across it, and the canal, which ran up and down the river, the canal boats could literally cross the river. There was opportunity for the mules that pulled the canal boats to cross using this bridge as well. Confederates arrived here and they wanted to cross this bridge. Union troops, actually just militia, had prepared a part of the bridge. They didn't want the Confederates to cross. And so they attempted to blow up a part of the bridge. It didn't work. So they set the bridge on fire and the fire started burning. Confederates looked for buckets in the town of Wrightsville, hoping they could form a bucket brigade and put out the fire. Townspeople said, "No, there are no buckets." The Union troops took all our buckets, and so the bridge burned. But the bridge burned further and further until the fire spread to the town of Wrightsville. Suddenly those missing buckets showed up, and the Confederates actually helped to defend the town, and they put out the fire. Later on, they were blamed for starting the fire in the northern newspapers. But anyway, it's a great story here. The bridge was destroyed, and that kept the Confederates from crossing that bridge and potentially making it to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Here's an old photograph of the bridge. What you're looking at here is you're looking at where the mules would come up the ramp and then cross the bridge so they could pull the canal boats across to the canal on the other side of the bridge. This bridge destroyed in 1863. The pylons, the stone supports for the bridge, later on served for a steel railroad bridge that was built there. That bridge stood for 100 years, and on the 100th anniversary of the destruction of the covered bridge, that bridge too was destroyed. Today, there are new bridges next to where this is, but the pylons are still there. So if you go to this area here and you take a look, the area that I've circled shows a concrete road bridge that was built in the 1930s. But if you see those little dots just to the north of the bridge, those are the supports that were there for that old covered bridge in 1863. The other bridge that you see in this picture in the upper left corner, that is the modern day Route 30 bridge. That is a 4-lane highway that crosses that one. Here's another photograph Most prominently in here, you see the arched concrete bridge, which was built in the 1930s, but in the foreground, you see the stone pillars. Those were the pylons or the supports for that old covered bridge. Incidentally, every year there's a festival that's held in the town of Wrightsville that sort of celebrates, or commemorates, I should say, the burning of the original bridge. And every 10 years, they do something pretty cool. They commemorate the burning of the bridge by building a bonfire on the top of every one of those pillars, and they call the festival Flames Across the Susquehanna. So that's everything that we're going to talk about leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg, and important and related. But some questions to think about here was, would the Army of Northern Virginia be able to supply in Pennsylvania without its supply trains? The idea was to come to Pennsylvania and live off the land. That's a big gamble that Robert E. Lee is taking. Another big question of this whole northern invasion was, would those Copperheads, those people in favor of ending the war and making peace with the South, would they be able to convince more people now that war was being fought on their own homeland? The other possibility is, what about Vicksburg? Robert E. Lee wanted to take his army and go save Vicksburg, but the Confederate president wanted Lee to stay with the Army of Northern Virginia and go with this invasion of the North. So Robert E. Lee's following orders, but it's not his strategy. He wanted to go save Vicksburg. That's going to play in very big here by the time we get to the end of the Battle of Gettysburg. Because guess what happens? The Battle of Gettysburg ends on July 3rd, and on July 4th, Vicksburg surrenders to Grant. And so talk about a double whammy for the South. They lose the Battle of Gettysburg one day, and the next day they lose the most important city they have as far as getting supplies to the internal parts of the Confederacy. And then finally, there's this question of, do Union soldiers have a new and important cause? You know, it's one thing to send soldiers off to fight in a war somewhere else. Do they fight with greater fervor when they're defending their homeland? And so that's another question. Well, that's it for this presentation. As always, be sure to look at Schoology. There may be some additional requirements. If you made it all the way through the end of this very lengthy presentation, number one, I thank you. And number two, I can tell you this is the last of these long presentations. So I can hear you cheering even right now. So thanks again, and I'll see you back in class.